In his past life, he used to talk to plants, and all his colleagues laughed at him. But his seedlings always yielded the best harvest. Now he has awakened in a dead world, in the body of a destitute F-rank farmer. And for the first time, the earth beneath his hands glowed green. But let's go back a couple of hours. The first thing he feels is cold, not winter cold, the cold of the dead earth. He lies face down on the clay floor, pressing someone else's fingers into the cracks, thin, calloused, with broken nails. He rolls onto his back and opens his eyes. A translucent inscription hangs above his head, glowing with a dim white light. Cyrus, rank F, class, farmer, level 1. He reaches out toward the letters. His fingers pass right through them. He sits up. His head splits as if someone had driven a nail into the back of his skull. He looks himself over and freezes. A thin body, ribs sticking out through a dirty shirt, arms as thin as twigs. This isn't his body. The last thing he remembers is Highway 180. 3 in the morning, the headlights of an oncoming truck. Then nothing. And now a hut. Clay walls, a hearth without a fire. On the shelf, small bags filled with something loose, a gray light outside the window. He stands up. His legs buckle and he grabs the wall. His body isn't just weak, it's drained to the core, as if everything alive had been taken from him, leaving only a shell. He grabs a stale flatbread from the table and swallows it without chewing. He washes it down with water from a mug. The water tastes of iron. He turns to the shelf, unties the small bag, pours the seeds into his palm. The grain resembles spelt but is larger. The husk is thick and dense. He brings it to his nose and inhales. Dry, dusty, and beneath that, a barely perceptible hint of life, a drought-resistant variety. He realizes this instantly, and right then he remembers who he is. His name was Daniel Ha, 34 years old, an agronomist and plant breeder, a Cornell graduate. For 8 years, he bred drought-tolerant varieties of corn and soybeans. He knows what healthy soil smells like and what dead soil smells like. He can tell the difference between a pH of 4 and a pH of 6 by taste. And now, in a foreign body in the middle of who knows what, he's clutching the seeds and clinging to the only thing he understands. Seeds. Dan steps outside. Light hits his eyes. Not sunlight. Dull and gray with a reddish tinge, as if the sky were covered in eternal ash. A hut stands on the edge of a destitute village. Beyond it lies a field. He walks toward it, and with every step the ground beneath his feet grows drier, gray, cracked. Pitiful black stalks stick up, dead. He crouches down, rubs a handful of soil between his fingers. Loam baked into stone. Brings it to his nose. Not a hint of mycelium. Touches it with his tongue. The acid hits him immediately. pH around 4.5. Lead. And something else he can't identify. The microbiome is completely dead, not a single worm. This soil hasn't been treated. It was left to die. He straightens up and looks ahead, a gray plain stretching to the horizon, not a tree, not a bush. And this is where the strangest part begins. A silhouette stands on the distant hill, a four-legged creature, with 3 necks, each crowned with something like a head, but not a head. It stands motionless, staring in his direction. He should be afraid, but only one thought echoes in his head. Fine, let's say I'm here for a while. He returns to the hut and notices a rolled-up sheet of rough paper on the table. The letters are unfamiliar, but he reads them. His body remembers this language. Cyrus owes the village elder a sack of grain to the village elder by the end of the moon. He won't give it. They'll take the hut. 14 days until the end of the moon. Dan smirks. He understands debt. With a loan for Cornell and a pickup truck payment plan, you learn to handle debt fast. He sits down by the field and closes his eyes. Facts. A foreign body. Dead earth. The system classifies him as F-grade trash. A creature behind the hill. 14 days. There's no point in panicking. Either a dream, or the afterlife, or reality. Any option means one thing. Do what you know how to do. He returns and goes through all the little bags on the shelf. 6 of them. 5 contain seeds. Dry, empty. He opens the 6th one last. Inside is a single seed, large, heavy, with a thick golden shell. He takes it in his hand and feels it immediately. It's alive. For real. It's pulsing, quietly, like the breath of a sleeping child. Dan clenches it in his fist and smiles for the first time. 1 seed. Dead earth. 14 days. It's been worse. He gets to work. Behind the hut, he finds an old garbage pit. Rat bones at the bottom. He gathers them and crushes them with 2 stones until his fingers start to bleed. Bone meal, phosphorus and calcium. He scoops the ashes out of the hearth. Potassium. He walks past the village into a ravine where the soil is slightly moister. He digs with his hands for half an hour and pulls out a worm. Then 4 more. He carefully wraps the 5 worms in a wet clump of earth. Near the hut, he picks a softer spot. He digs a hole. He pours the bone meal into the bottom. He adds the ashes. He mixes it all together. He places the worms inside. He waters it. And he takes out a golden seed. In his past life, he had a habit that everyone considered strange. He talked to plants. Seriously. He would sit next to the sprouts and tell them how his day had gone. His colleagues would tap their fingers against their temples. But Dan's sprouts always yielded the best harvest. Always. And now, in the midst of a dead world, he leans toward the seed and whispers, "Well then, little one, let's give it a try. I don't know where I am. I don't know what you are. But I know one thing. You're alive. And I'm alive. That's enough." He places the seed in the hole, covers it with soil, presses down with his palms, waters it. And the earth begins to glow, dimly. A greenish light emanates from where the seed lies. Dan pulls his hands away. The glow lasts 3 seconds and fades. He looks at the hole, then at his palms. An inscription flashes above his head. Cyrus, rank F, class, farmer, level 1. Nothing has changed. The system looks at him and sees trash. But the earth saw something else. He slept next to the hole, right on the ground. The temperature dropped at night and he woke up shivering. Cyrus's body was weak and thin. The cold crept under his shirt and gnawed at his ribs. Dan sat up and looked at the planting site. Nothing. The earth was dark and damp, but there was no sprout. He didn't expect the seed to sprout in a single night. Any grain takes time, but the glow wouldn't leave him alone. In his world, the earth didn't glow. Not once. Under no circumstances. He got up and went into the hut. He needed water. He searched every corner and found a clay jug under the bench, empty. So he needed a spring. He went outside. The village was waking up. An old woman with a hunched back crawled out of the neighboring hut. She looked at him with cloudy eyes and turned away. A man with a vacant stare emerged from another. Hovering above his head was rank F, class farmer, level 3. Level 3. So experience is being gained, slowly but surely. Dan approached the man and asked where to get water. The man silently pointed eastward. Dan walked in the indicated direction. After 200 steps, he found a well. The stonework was cracked. The rope was rotten. The bucket was wooden with cracks. He lowered the bucket. The rope stretched out. The bucket plopped down far below. He pulled it up. It was a third full of water, murky with a yellowish tint. He sniffed it. Iron. Lots of iron. But it was drinkable. He filled a jug and carried it back. On the way, he counted the houses. 7 huts. 1 or 2 people in each. In total, there were between 10 and 15 residents in the village. All rank F. All farmers. All with the blank faces of people who had long since given up hope. He returned to the hole and watered the ground, carefully, in a thin stream. Then he sat down nearby and began to speak. He told the seed about the village, about the people with empty eyes, about the old woman who didn't even say hello, about the third-level man who, in his entire life, had gained 3 levels doing the same thing over and over. He told it about the field, about the dead earth, about the soil's acidity, which no normal plant could survive. He spoke quietly, not for anyone else, for Semyon. Like in the greenhouses of Iowa, the day passed in work. Dan surveyed everything around the village within a radius of 500 paces. He found a ravine with worms. There, he also discovered moss on the north side of the rocks. Living moss. So not everything is dead. He gathered the moss. He ground it up and mixed it with water. It turned into a greenish paste. He poured it around the hole. Microorganisms. Maybe something from the moss would take root in the soil near the seed. In the evening, a girl came to him. She stood 10 paces away and watched as he sat by the hole in the ground. Hovering above her head was Aylin, rank F, class farmer, level 2. She looked about 19. Her dark hair was pulled back into a bun. Her face was sharp, with high cheekbones. Her eyes were stubborn. She asked what he was doing. Dan replied that he was planting. She said he was wasting water and that nothing would grow from this soil. It had always been that way. Her mother was the village elder, and she knew. Dan nodded and continued watering. Aileen stood there for another minute and left. On the second night, he slept by the hole again. He woke up at dawn and saw it. A sprout was sticking out of the ground. Pale green, thin, 2 centimeters tall. Dan froze. Then he slowly leaned down. The sprout was strange. It didn't look like any plant he knew. The stem was thicker than it should be for that size. There was only one leaf, but it was wide, and on the surface of the leaf was a fine pattern, like veins, like blood vessels. Dan touched it with his fingertip. The sprout shuddered. Not from the wind. There was no wind. It trembled at his touch. Alive. Truly alive. Not like a plant, like a living thing. Dan's breath caught in his throat. He pulled his hand back, then reached out again, touched it gently. The sprout reached toward his finger, like a sunflower toward the sun, only there was no sun. It was reaching for Dan. Dan swallowed. He sat down on the ground and said, "Hello, little one. Grow. I'm here." Day after day, he tended to the sprout. He watered it in the morning. In the afternoon, he gathered materials. Bones from the pit, ashes from fireplaces. He walked around the village and asked the residents for fireplace ashes. Most gave them to him without a word. Some looked at him suspiciously. One old man asked why he needed the ashes. Dan explained that the ashes contain potassium, which helps plants grow. The old man looked at him as if he were crazy and shut the door. In the evening, Dan returned to the sprout. He sat down next to it and talked. He told it about his past life, about the cornfields of Iowa, about what a real summer looks like, about the smell of freshly cut grass, about the rain. It hadn't rained here even once since he woke up. On the 5th day, the sprout reached 20 centimeters. It no longer looked like a plant. The stem had become woody. It was covered with a thin bark. Dark, almost black. The leaf had unfurled into 3 leaves, each with the same vein pattern. And something had appeared at the tip. A swelling on the stem. Round. The size of a fist. Like a bud. But not a bud. Dan looked closer. The swelling had a shape. Barely discernible. If you squinted, you could see it. A face. Closed eyes. Tightly pressed lips. A sleeping face. A chill ran through him. He wasn't afraid, but the realization that this wasn't just a plant hit him like a blow. He wasn't growing a crop. He was growing someone. On the 6th day, Eileen came to him again. This time she came closer. She saw the sprout. She saw the face at the top. She recoiled. She asked what it was. Dan answered honestly that he didn't know, but it was alive, and it was growing. Eileen said her mother would be furious, that such a thing was considered heresy, that the system determined who was worth what, and any attempt to create something outside the system was punished. Dan asked who punishes them. Eileen didn't answer. She just looked toward the wasteland and walked away. On the 7th day, Dan did what he'd been putting off. He urinated into the hole next to the sprout. Phosphorus and nitrogen. Urine is one of the oldest fertilizers. They talked about this in freshman year at Cornell. Of course, he didn't do that in Iowa. But this isn't Iowa. There's no ammonium nitrate, no urea, no NPK complex here. There's only him and his body. So his body will be the source. The sprout grew. By the 10th that day, it had reached a meter in height. The stem was as thick as a wrist. The bark was black with golden veins. The face at the top became distinct. Closed eyes, a thin nose, lips pressed into a line. The features resembled a mask. a theatrical mask with smooth lines and a frozen expression of peace. Dan sat nearby every evening. He was no longer just talking about the past. He was telling the sprout about the present, about the village headwoman who was due to come in 4 days to collect a debt, about the woman who had once been kind. He didn't know this for sure, but the note said that Cyrus owed a sack of grain. Not half a sack, a whole sack. So the village headwoman had lent it out once. So she had once believed it would be repaid. He told the sprout about Eileen, about the girl with the stubborn eyes who had come twice and both times left without saying goodbye, about how she was afraid, not of him, not of the sapling, of something bigger. On the 12th day, the sapling stirred. Dan was sitting nearby and saw it with his own eyes. The trunk swayed, not from the wind, from within. The face at the top changed its expression. The lips parted slightly, just a tiny bit, as if it were trying to breathe. Dan placed his palm on the trunk. Something was beating beneath the bark, rhythmically, slowly, like a pulse. He whispered, "Just a little longer, you're almost ready." On the 13th day, the village elder arrived. The headwoman did not come alone. 2 men followed her, broad-shouldered, with dull, heavy faces. Above each hung Rank D, Class Guard. Dan stood by his hut. He saw them from afar. The headwoman was a woman of about 50, lean, upright, with a face that had once been beautiful but had now grown hard. Above her hung Rank E, Class Administrator. She stopped 5 steps away from Dan. She looked down at him, even though she was shorter. She knew how to look like that. She said the deadline had passed, that she needed a sack of grain, that she had no time to wait, that in 14 days he hadn't grown a thing, that the hut now belonged to the village. Dan listened in silence. One of the guards stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. A heavy one. Rank D was 4 levels above his F. The difference was like that between a child and an adult. The guard could break his arm with a single movement. Dan looked at the hand on his shoulder, then at the village head. He asked for 10 minutes. The village head grimaced. One of the guards snorted, but she nodded. Maybe out of curiosity. Maybe because somewhere deep inside her, there was still a remnant of the woman who used to lend money. Dan turned and walked over to the sprout. 13 days. He had fed it bone meal and ash, watered it 3 times a day, with his own saliva when the water ran out. Told it about the village every evening, about the people with empty eyes, about the village head who had broken down, about Eileen who was afraid, about the land that was dying. He had put everything he had into that seed: time, attention, words, the warmth of his palms, the only food he could find. He starved himself to feed the sprout. The sprout stood before him, 6 feet tall, black bark, golden veins, a face at the top with closed eyes. Dan dropped to his knees. He placed both palms on the trunk. He felt a pulse beneath the bark, slow and steady. He leaned close to the trunk itself and whispered, "Rise up, show them who I am." The earth trembled, not a metaphor, literally shuddered. The tremor traveled from the roots up the trunk. The bark began to crack, not breaking, but opening, like shutters, like the petals of a giant flower. Light poured out of the cracks, golden, bright, so bright that Dan recoiled and covered his eyes with his hand. When he opened them, a figure stood before him, 2 meters tall, a body of black bark and golden grain, broad shoulders, long arms, legs sinking into the ground with roots that slowly detached and became feet. A face, that very face with closed eyes. Now the eyes were open, yellow, like ripe wheat, calm and deep. On the right shoulder was attached something like a vine twisted into a cord. The figure stood and looked at Dan. Then it slowly raised its arm. The vine on its shoulder unfurled, stretched out, took shape. A long, curved blade on a wooden handle. A scythe. An inscription flashed above the figure. Harvester. Rank A. Class Harvester. Rank A. Dan stared at the inscription, looked at his own. Rank F. Looked back. Rank A. An F-rank farmer had raised an A-rank creature. He laughed, briefly, hoarsely, without joy, just from the absurdity of it. The reaper turned his head toward Dan, tilted it, just a little, like a dog trying to understand its master. Then he took a step. The ground beneath his foot cracked. He weighed more than he looked. He took a second step, stood next to Dan, and turned to face the village elder and the guards. They were standing where he had left them, 10 paces away. The village elder didn't move. Her staff lay on the ground. She had dropped it. The guards. One turned pale. The second took a step back, then forward. The instinct of a D-rank fighter worked faster than reason. He clenched his fist and lunged at the harvester. The harvester didn't even turn his head. His hand moved, slowly, smoothly. 2 wooden fingers closed around the guard's fist. Just caught it, like catching a ball. The guard jerked, to no avail. The reaper held his fist with 2 fingers and didn't move. Then he pressed gently, not hard, just enough for the guard to understand. The guard turned even paler. The reaper unclenched his fingers and gently pressed on his shoulder. The guard sat down on the ground. He didn't fall. He sat down, like a child who'd been told to sit down. The second guard didn't try. Dan walked over to the village elder. She was looking past him, at the reaper. Her hands were shaking. Dan bent down and picked up the small bag of seeds from the ground. He held it out to her. He said he wouldn't give up the grain. He would give 10 times as much, in a month, and she would tell him who had banned crop rotation in this village and why. The village elder turned her gaze to him. For the first time, she looked him in the eyes. She didn't answer, but she didn't object either. She turned and walked away. The guards got up and followed her. One of them was limping. Dan stood and watched them go. The reaper stood nearby, motionless, silent. The vine scythe hung from his shoulder in a relaxed arc. Dan turned to him, looked into his yellow eyes. They were warm, not angry, not cold, warm, like sunlight that never reaches this place. Dan said, "Hello, I've been waiting for you." The reaper bowed his head, again, with the same movement, and for the first time he opened his mouth. The sound was strange, deep, like the creak of wood in the wind. But the words were clear. He said, "Father." Dan flinched. The words struck him in the chest harder than it should have. He wasn't a father. Never had been. In his past life, he had no wife, no children, not even a dog. Only work, only seeds, only quiet conversations with sprouts in empty greenhouses. And now, standing before him was a 6-foot-tall figure made of bark and grain, with a scythe on his shoulder, calling him father. He swallowed the lump in his throat, nodded, then turned toward the field, the dead, gray field, and uttered a single word: "Let's work." They spent the rest of the day together. Dan showed him. The reaper did the work. His A-rank strength meant he could plow the earth with his bare hands, literally. He plunged his fingers into the caked crust and broke it apart like bread. Dan followed behind him, crumbling bone meal and ash into the furrows. He no longer had any worms, but the reaper found them himself. He sensed life beneath the earth. He would walk to the ravine and return with handfuls of worms, which he carried carefully in his cupped palms. Dan watched this and couldn't find the words. A creature of wood and grain, born of dead earth, carrying worms in his palms and afraid to crush them. By evening, they had prepared a plot 3 by 3 meters, small, but enough for a start. Dan planted 12 seeds from the remaining bags in this plot. Ordinary seeds, dead according to his initial assessment. But now the soil was different. Bone meal, ash, worms, and something else. When the reaper walked across the ground, his root feet left something behind in the soil. Dan noticed this by midday. Where the reaper had stepped, the earth darkened. It became softer. It smelled different, not like living soil, but like something close to it. He took a sample and tasted it. The pH rose, from 4.5 to just over 5. Insignificant. But in agronomy, insignificant often means everything. If the reaper walked across the prepared plot every day for a week, the pH could rise to 6. And at 6, it's already possible to grow. to truly grow. Not warriors, food. Dan sat at the edge of the field and watched the sunset. The sunset here was red. Not a warm red, but a painful one. The color of a wound, the color of inflamed skin. But he was getting used to it. Jatvenik stood nearby, silent. His silence wasn't empty. It was like the silence of a man who is listening. Dan told him that they would start on a different plot, that he needed a lot of land, that in a month, food would be growing here. The reaper nodded, with one slow movement. Then he said, "Father, the earth hears you." Dan looked at him, asked what he meant. The reaper didn't answer. He just stood there and looked at the field, at the dead, gray field that was supposed to come alive in a month. The news spread through the village overnight. An F-rank farmer had grown an A-rank creature from the earth. It was impossible. Everyone knew this. The heavenly judgment system had existed for 100 years. It determined everyone's rank at birth. A rank could rise, but slowly, very slowly. An F could become an E after a decade of hard work. An E could become a D if they were lucky. Farmers never rose above D. Never. It was the law, unwritten, just a fact. And now that law had crumbled. In the morning, 3 villagers came to Dan's hut. They stood at a distance and watched. The reaper sat by the wall of the hut, motionless as a statue. His yellow eyes were closed. He wasn't asleep. Dan had already realized that the reaper wasn't asleep. He just sometimes closed his eyes and listened. The earth, the wind, something Dan couldn't hear. The villagers watched and whispered. Then they left. Around noon, Eileen arrived. This time she didn't stop at a distance. She came right up close. She looked at the reaper. He opened his eyes and looked at her. She didn't flinch. She stood straight, stubborn as always. She told Dan that her mother was furious. That last night the village elder had sent a messenger to the nearest fortified town. That in 2 weeks the Oracle Guild inspector would arrive. That the oracles do not tolerate anomalies. That if the inspector saw the reaper, the village might be burned down. All of it, down to the last hut, along with the villagers. Dan listened. Then he asked why she was telling him this. Eileen paused. Then she said she didn't know. Maybe because yesterday she saw him talking to the earth and it piqued her curiosity. Maybe because the reaper had pinned a guard to the ground instead of killing him. She said that in her whole life she'd seen only one kind of power, the kind that kills. And this was different. Dan nodded. He asked how much time they had before the inspector arrived. Eileen said 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the messenger got lost in the wastes. Dan said he needed her help. Eileen tensed up. She asked what kind. He said he needed to know everything about the village, who lived there, how old everyone is, what they can do, what tools they have, where they get their food, how much food they have left. Eileen looked at him. Then she asked why. He answered simply, because he was going to feed this village. And to do that, he needed to know what he was working with. Eileen left. She returned 3 hours later. With her was the very same old man who had shut the door in Dan's face when he asked for ashes. The old man stood shifting from foot to foot. Eileen said his name was Tobias, that he was 61 years old, that he was the oldest resident of the village, that he remembered the days when something still grew here. Dan sat down on the ground and asked Tobias to sit next to him. The old man sat down. Dan asked what used to grow here. Tobias spoke slowly. 30 years ago, when he was young, rye grew in these fields. Rye. The harvest was meager but sufficient. Then a decree came from the fortress city. They forbade changing crops. They ordered them to sow only rye, every year, just rye, in the same fields, without a break. Dan closed his eyes. 30 years of monoculture, no crop rotation, no soil rest, no legumes for nitrogen fixation. Of course the land had died. He asked who had given the order. Tobias said the decree had come from the Guild of Oracles, through the regional governor, that the wording was simple. The system had determined the optimal crop for this area. Changing it was forbidden. Anyone who violated the order would be stripped of their status and exiled to the wastes. Dan opened his eyes. He looked at Eileen. She stood with a stony face. She knew. She had known all along. He asked Tobias if he remembered what crop rotation was. The old man shook his head. Then he paused. He said his grandmother had mentioned something like that you had to rotate, one field of rye, another of peas, the third left empty. Then you switch. Dan nodded. He stood up. He walked over to the prepared plot. He picked up a stick and began drawing on the ground. 3 squares. The first, grains, rye or something like the spelt from Cyrus's sacks. The second, legumes, if he could find even a single legume seed in the area. The third, fallow, empty, rest for the soil. He drew and explained. Eileen and Tobias listened. Tobias with his mouth open, Eileen with narrowed eyes. She wasn't just listening, she was memorizing. Dan explained that legumes attach bacteria to their roots. He didn't use the word bacteria because they wouldn't have understood. He said that legume roots capture invisible food from the air and feed it to the soil. That if you plant legumes and grains in rotation, the soil heals itself. That it wasn't magic. That's just how the world works. Tobias stared at him with wide eyes. Then he said quietly that his grandmother had said something similar, and that they had burned her for it. Dan froze. He looked at Tobias. He looked at Eileen. She turned away. Tobias continued. He said that 50 years ago, a woman lived in the village who knew how to heal the land. She planted different plants and talked to them. The land around her house was green, the only green patch for miles around. Then people came from the fortress city, the oracles. They said she was a heretic, that her practices contradicted the system. They burned her field, then they burned her house, then they burned her. Tobias fell silent. Dan stood there, staring at the stick in his hand, at the 3 squares drawn on the ground. Knowledge that on Earth is taught in the first year of the agricultural faculty. Here, people were killed for it. He stuck the stick into the ground. He turned to the reaper. The reaper was standing by the wall of the hut, listening. His yellow eyes were open. There was something new in them, not anger, something quieter, resolve. Dan said, "We start today." They worked the rest of the day. Dan divided the prepared plot into 3 parts. In the first, he planted seeds from Cyrus's pouches, ordinary grains. Nothing in the second, a patch. And he left the third empty because he had no legume seeds. But the harvester solved that problem. In the evening, he went to the ravine and returned an hour later. In his palms lay 3 small pods, wild peas. They grew in the shade of the rocks at the bottom of the ravine, tiny, pitiful, but alive. Dan took the pods. He opened them. Inside were seeds, small, but real, legumes, nitrogen fixation. He planted them in the second part of the plot, watered them, sat down nearby. And for the first time in 13 days in this world, he thought that maybe he would succeed. At night, he lay by the hut and looked up at the sky. The sky here was strange, not black, dark red, starless. Only a crack, a long, jagged line stretching across the entire horizon. A faint light seeped from it. The Great Rift. A hole in the sky through which, 100 years ago, something had poured forth and destroyed this world. The reaper stood nearby, silent. His silence had become familiar, soothing, like the sound of rain which never falls here. Dan closed his eyes. He had 2 weeks left before the inspector arrived. He had to make it in time. During the first week after the reaper's awakening, the area had changed. Dan saw it every morning. The earth where the reaper trod darkened by a shade. Then by 2. By the 5th day, it had turned almost black. Not a dead black, but a living one. Rich, moist. He'd take a handful and rub it between his fingers, feeling something he hadn't felt since his first day in this world. Texture. Not a caked-on crust, but loose soil with clumps. He tasted it. pH 5 and 8, almost 6. A little more, and he could grow anything. The grain seeds from Cyrus's pouches sprouted on the 3rd day, weak, pale, but alive. Thin green threads poked out of the black soil like needles. 12 sprouts out of 12, 100% germination rate. In dead soil that everyone considered hopeless. The peas sprouted on the 4th day. Dan sat next to them every evening. He didn't speak, he just watched. The peas were ordinary. They didn't glow, they didn't pulsate. They had no face. An ordinary plant. And from this, Dan felt a relief he hadn't expected. Not everything in this world was an anomaly. Some things worked just like they did back home. Legume roots, nitrogen fixation, symbiosis with soil bacteria. He couldn't see the bacteria, but he knew they were there. Because a week later, the soil around the peas smelled different, fresher, more alive. That very scent of actinomycetes he hadn't sensed since the first day. The scent of healthy soil. The scent after rain. He closed his eyes and breathed in. And for a second, it seemed to him that he was standing in a field in Iowa in July. Then he opened his eyes and saw the red sky with a crack. The villagers came to watch. 2 or 3 every day. They stood at a distance. They whispered. At first they looked at the harvester, then at Dan, then at the sprouts, at the green sprouts in the black soil. To them, it was a miracle. Dan knew it wasn't a miracle. It was the first course in agronomy. But he kept quiet. Let them think it's a miracle. The main thing was that they weren't afraid. On the 8th day after the harvest man's awakening, a woman came to Dan. A young woman, thin to the point of transparency, with a child in her arms. The boy was about 3 years old. A rank F-class farmer hovered above the woman. An F hovered above the boy, too. She stopped 5 steps away. She wasn't looking at the harvester, at the sprouts, at the greenery. Then she looked at Dan. She didn't say anything. She just stood there. Dan understood. He went into the hut. He came back with a piece of flatbread, the last one. He held it out to her. She took it. She broke it. She gave half to the child. She ate the other half herself. Then she left. Dan stood and watched her go. The reaper stood beside him. His yellow eyes followed the woman and the child. Then he turned to Dan and said, "Father, they're hungry." Dan nodded. He knew. On the 9th day, he made a decision. He needed more grainmen, not for battle, for work. One reaper couldn't till enough land to feed 15 people. Dan returned to the ravine. He searched all day. He turned over every rock. He crawled along the bottom on all 4s. By evening, he found what he was looking for. 2 seeds, not ordinary ones, just like the golden ones, heavy, with a thick shell. One was brown, the other was silver. They lay in a crevice between the rocks, covered in sand, as if someone had hidden them long ago. He brought them to the hut, placed them on the table, sat down and looked at them. 2 seeds, 2 potential grainmen. But he couldn't grow them like a reaper, not physically. The reaper had taken 13 days of his full attention, every minute, every thought. He starved, he didn't sleep, he gave everything. 2 seeds at once would mean each would get half the attention, half the care, and the result would be worse, maybe D rank, maybe C, enough for field work, not enough to defend the village. He sat and thought. The reaper stood by the door, silently. Then Dan made a decision. 1 seed now, the second later, quality over quantity. He chose the brown one, took it in his palm. It was warm, not as warm as the golden one, but alive. He went out to the plot, chose a spot next to the grain sprouts, prepared a hole, bone meal, ashes, 3 worms that the reaper had brought that morning. He watered it, sat down nearby, and began to speak. But this time he spoke of something else, not about the village, not about himself, about a woman with a child, about a boy who is 3 years old and already knows what hunger is, about how in this world, children are born with a letter over their heads, and that letter decides everything. He placed the seed in the hole, covered it with soil, pressed it down with his palms, whispered, "You will feed them, not with a sword, not with a scythe. You will be the one who works in the field and never tires. You will be the one who carries water and never complains. You will be the one who stands by when things are hard and remains silent, because your silence is help itself." The earth glowed, fainter than the first time. A greenish light flashed and faded. Dan nodded. Good, the foundation has been laid. At the same time, he worked with the regular seedlings. The grains grew slowly. The peas grew faster. By the 10th day, the peas had sprouted tendrils and began clinging to the sticks Dan had stuck nearby. The grain stalks had strengthened. They had darkened. They had gained strength. Dan examined them and made a rough estimate. In 3 weeks, the first harvest. A small one, maybe a kilogram of grain, maybe 2. Not enough to feed the village, but enough to prove that the land could yield a crop. On the 11th day, Eileen came again. This time she brought something with her, a small, worn-out bag. She handed it to Dan without a word. He opened it. Inside were seeds, small, round, yellow. He took one, rolled it between his fingers, sniffed it. Turnip. It was a turnip. He looked at Eileen, asked where it came from. She said she found it at her grandmother's, in an old trunk. Her grandmother had hidden them for 30 years, after the oracles banned changing crops. Every year, Grandma would sort through the seeds and set aside the best ones. 30 years. 30 generations of selection. Dan held the seeds in his hand and his breath caught. 30 years of manual selection. Eileen's grandmother had been doing what he did in Iowa. No education, no lab, no understanding of genetics. She just picked the best ones and saved them. 30 years. He closed his eyes. then opened them. Looked at Eileen. She stood straight and tense, as if she were waiting for him to say the seeds were useless, that 30 years had been wasted. He said her grandmother was a genius. Eileen blinked. She clearly hadn't expected those words. Dan said that 30 generations of selection was a massive undertaking, that these seeds might be better than any he'd seen in this world, that Eileen's grandmother had done what entire institutes take years to accomplish. Eileen turned away, quickly, but he managed to see. Her eyes were shining. She said her grandmother had been burned, the very one Tobias had spoken of. Eileen's grandmother was the woman who knew how to heal the earth, the one the oracles had declared a heretic. Eileen had seen the field burn. She was 7 years old. Her mother had forced her to watch, so she would remember, so she would never try again. Dan was silent, not because he didn't know what to say, because words were unnecessary here. He handed Eileen a single turnip seed. He said, "Plant it yourself." Eileen looked at the seed, then at him, then at her hands. She took the seed. She walked over to the plot. She knelt down. She dug a hole with her fingers. She placed the seed inside. She covered it with soil. She watered it from the mug Dan had handed her. Her hands were shaking. The earth didn't glow. It was an ordinary seed, an ordinary turnip. But Eileen sat on her knees in front of that little hole and didn't get up. Dan sat down beside her, silently. The reaper stood 3 paces away, also silent. 3 figures by a small hole in the black earth. An F-rank farmer from another world, the F-rank daughter of the village headman with her dead grandmother, and an A-rank warrior of bark and grain who didn't understand why his father and this girl were sitting by a hole with a turnip, but felt that it was important. In the evening, Dan checked the brown sprout. 4 days after planting. A stem was sticking out of the ground, thin, pale, almost invisible, but alive. It grew slower than the harvester. Dan spoke to it every evening, but not the same way he spoke to the harvester. To the harvester, he spoke of pain. To this one, he spoke of work, of simple things, about how to carry water properly so as not to spill it, about how to plow a furrow evenly, about how important it is not to rush. He didn't pour drama into this seed. He poured calmness into it. There were 6 days left until the inspector arrived. The inspector arrived a day early. Dan saw him from the field, a lone figure on the crest of the hill, riding something resembling a horse but with 6 legs. 2 men in gray cloaks followed behind him. A sign hung above the inspector, which Dan could make out as he rode closer. Varen Tal, Rank B. Class, Oracle Investigator. Rank B, 2 ranks below the Reaper. But Dan knew that rank wasn't everything. Oracles work differently. They didn't fight with their fists. They read. The system, people, the connections between things. Varen Tal dismounted at the edge of the village, short, lean, about 40 years old. His face was smooth and expressionless, like a wall. His eyes were gray, cold, not evil, just empty. The eyes of a man who had seen too many anomalies and grown weary of them. The village elder came out to meet him. She bowed. She spoke quickly. She pointed toward Dan's hut. Dan stood by his plot. The reaper stood beside him. The brown sprout had grown to 30 centimeters in 5 days. The grains had strengthened. Peas were twining around the stakes. Eileen's turnip had produced its first 2 leaves, a green island in the middle of a gray desert. Varen approached. He stopped 10 paces away. He looked at the plot, then at the harvester, then at the inscription above Dan. Rank F, Class Farmer, Level 1. He wasn't surprised. Dan had expected surprise, or anger, or fear. Nothing. Varen just looked, the way a scientist looks at an image under a microscope. Then he spoke. His voice was even, quiet, without inflection. He said he had received a report of an F-rank anomaly, that an F-rank farmer had created an A-rank creature without the system's authorization, that such an act was classified as first-category heresy, that standard procedure called for the destruction of the anomaly and the cleansing of the site of its manifestation. Clearing the site of manifestation. Dan understood what that meant. The village. All 15 people. A woman with a 3-year-old child. Tobias. Eileen. Everyone. He looked at Varen, asked calmly, "Is this mandatory?" Varen tilted his head, said that standard procedure was mandatory, but he would conduct an inspection first. He approached the reaper. The harvester didn't move. He stood there looking down at the oracle. 2 meters against 6 feet 5. Varen raised his hand. A symbol appeared above his palm, a glowing circle with lines inside. He ran his hand along the harvester's body, from top to bottom. The symbol changed color, blue, green, yellow. Then it flashed white for a second and went out. Varen lowered his hand. For the first time, an expression appeared on his face. Barely noticeable, a shadow of something. Not fear, not surprise, confusion. He said that the system couldn't classify this creature, that its rank was confirmed as A, but its origin wasn't registered. The system doesn't see a point of creation, doesn't see a source, as if the Reaper had simply appeared, out of nowhere. Dan said he had grown him, from a seed, in the ground. Varen looked at him, for a long time. Then he walked over to the plot, crouched down, touched the soil, sniffed, looked at the sprouts, at the peas, at the grains, at the 2 turnip leaves. Then he stood up and walked over to the brown sprout, 30 centimeters, a thin stem, faceless. Faceless for now. Varen ran his hand over it, the symbol in place. The symbol flashed, once. Varen froze. Then he said quietly, "One more." Dan nodded. Varen straightened up. He stood silently, thinking. Dan waited. The 2 men in gray cloaks stood behind them and did not interfere. Then Varen did something Dan hadn't expected. He sent his men away. He told them to wait by the village. They left. Varen remained alone before Dan and the Reaper. He asked quietly, "How long have you been able to do this?" Dan replied that it had been since the very first day, that he had planted a seed and it had grown. Varen asked, "Do you know what the green bloods are?" Dan didn't know that word, but Cyrus's body did. Somewhere at the bottom of the memory of that foreign body, something stirred. Cold, dark, fear. The body remembered that fear. Dan said he didn't know. Varen looked at him. He read him. Oracles can read lies. Dan wasn't lying. He really didn't know. Varen nodded. Then he said, 50 years ago, a woman was burned in this village. He knew. He'd read the report. A standard cleanup of a heretical anomaly. Case closed. But now, standing before the green patch in the middle of the dead land, he was thinking of something else. He asked Dan, "You can grow food?" Dan said he could. That in 2 weeks there would be a first harvest. Small, but real. Varen was silent. Then he said, "In the city, Fortress of Valtrin, where I'm supposed to send the report, 40,000 people live. Grain supplies will run out in 3 months. Shipments from the southern provinces have been cut off. Lord Caedmon has begun the harvest, and the farming villages in the south are no longer producing. In 3 months, Valtrin will begin to starve." He looked at the patch, at the greenery, at the Reaper. Then back at Dan, he said, "I'll write in the report that the anomaly turned out to be a false alarm, that the local mayor was mistaken, that there's nothing here but a destitute village with a barren field." Dan looked at him, waiting for him to continue. Varen said, "But in a month I'll be back, and I'll bring seeds with me, lots of seeds, and you'll show me how you do it, not creating creatures." He nodded at the harvester. That was what he didn't understand and didn't want to understand. Food. Show me how to grow food in dead soil. Dan asked what would happen to the village. Varen said the village would remain. As long as he was alive and as long as his report was in the archives, the village would be listed as empty and uninteresting. But if someone else found out, someone higher in rank, someone from the capital, then he wouldn't be able to do anything. Dan understood. Time. Varen was giving him time. Not out of kindness, out of calculation. 40,000 hungry mouths in 3 months. And 1 F-rank farmer who knows how to revive dead soil. The math is simple. Varen turned and walked toward the village. At the edge, he paused, turned around, spoke. "Don't grow any more of those." He pointed at the Reaper. "Don't grow them for now. Grow food. We don't need creatures." Dan didn't answer. Varen left. An hour later, he drove off with his men. The village elder stood by her hut and watched him go. Then she looked at Dan. There was something new in her eyes. Not rage, not fear, confusion. She didn't understand why the inspector had left, why the village was intact, why that F-rank boy was still alive. Aileen approached Dan that evening. She asked what the inspector had said. Dan replied that they had a month. Aileen asked what for. Dan looked out at the field, at the gray, endless plain beyond the plot, and said, "To grow enough food that it won't be worth our while to kill us." Aileen was silent. Then, for the first time in a long while, she smiled, briefly, with just one corner of her mouth, and said she'd help. Dan nodded. That night he sat by the brown sprout. It had grown to 40 centimeters. A growth had appeared on the stem, small, the size of a walnut, faceless. For now. Dan placed his palm on the stem, warm, alive, pulsing. He said, "Take your time. We have time. Grow in peace." Then he looked at the reaper. The reaper was standing by the hut, gazing toward the wastelands. Dan asked what he saw. The reaper replied, "Something's coming." Dan stood up. He walked over. He looked in the same direction. Darkness, a red sky, a crack. And far on the horizon, very far, lights, many lights, moving. Dan asked what it was. The harvester said, "People, lots of people. They're coming this way." Dan stood and looked at the lights. Then he turned toward the plot, toward the green sprouts, toward the brown sprout, toward the silvery seed that lay in the hut, waiting its turn. He had a month. The lights on the horizon suggested there might not be a month. The lights turned out to be refugees. 32 people, women, old people, children. There were almost no men. 3 cripples and 1 teenager of about 15. They had come from the south. They had walked for 4 days through the wastes, without food, almost without water. Their village had been burned by Cadman's reapers. They approached the village at dawn. Dan stood at the edge and watched. 32 people, dirty, exhausted, with eyes in which nothing remained. A rank hung over each one. F, 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 E, F, F. All farmers, all useless by the system's standards. A woman at the head of the column was carrying a girl of about 5 in her arms. The girl wasn't moving. Dan walked over. He touched the child's forehead. Hot, fever, dehydration. If she isn't given water in the next few hours, she'll die. He turned to the reaper, said one word, "Water." The reaper went to the well, returned a minute later with a full bucket, carried it with one hand. Dan took the mug, sipped some water, brought it to the girl's lips. She drank greedily. She choked. He took the mug away, waited, gave her more. The girl's mother stood and watched, not at him, at the reaper. A 2-meter-tall creature made of black bark with a scythe on its shoulder was handing over a bucket of water. She didn't scream. She didn't run away. She had no strength left to be afraid. Dan gave water to the refugees one by one, mug after mug. The reaper carried water, bucket after bucket. The well yielded murky water with a taste of iron, but it was water. An hour later, everyone had been given water. Dan stood before them and counted. 32, plus 15 villagers. 47 people. His plot could feed 5, maybe 7, if he was very frugal. 47. He needed 6 times more food, 6 times more land, 6 times more of everything. He closed his eyes. He thought. He opened them. He walked to the hut. He took out the silvery seed, the one he had been saving, the one he wanted to plant later, when he prepared the perfect soil, when there was time and peace. There was no time. There was no peace. He went out to the field, not to his plot, to the field, to the dead, gray earth. He chose a spot, dug a hole, poured in the last handful of bone meal, the last handful of ash, watered it, placed the seed. He couldn't give this seed 13 days of care, couldn't sit beside it every evening, couldn't starve for its sake because now 47 people were starving, and he had to think of them. He gave it what he could. 1 minute. 1 minute of complete, focused attention. He leaned over the hole and whispered, "I don't have time. I'm sorry, but I need you. Not for battle, not for glory. I need your hands to dig, your legs to walk this earth, your patience, nothing more. Just be." The earth flickered greenish, faintly, barely noticeable. Dan stood up. He looked at the hole, then at the reaper. The reaper stood nearby, staring at the planting spot. His yellow eyes were unmoving. Dan couldn't read the expression on the wooden face, but something in the reaper's posture had changed, barely perceptible. His shoulders had dropped slightly. His head had tilted slightly. Dan understood. Jealousy. Not malicious, quiet, painful. The harvester had seen his father plant a new seed, speak words to it, imbue it with something. Dan walked over to the harvester, stood beside him, placed a hand on his bark. It was warm beneath his palm. He said, "You're my first. That won't change. Never." The harvester turned his head, looked at Dan. His eyes were the same, warm, like a sun that isn't here. But something trembled deep inside. He nodded, slowly, once. Dan took his hand away, turned to the refugees. They were sitting on the ground at the edge of the village, waiting. Not knowing what for, just waiting because there was nowhere else to go. He walked over to them, sat down on the ground, at their level, looked into their faces. Tired, empty, broken. He said they could stay, that there wasn't much food, but there would be more, that there was water here, there was land, there was him. A woman with a girl in her arms looked at him. She asked who he was. Dan answered, "A farmer." She looked at the reaper standing 10 paces away. She looked at the inscription above Dan, Rank F. She looked back at him. She didn't believe him, but she nodded. For the rest of the day, Dan organized things. He had never led people. In Iowa, he'd worked alone. In the lab, he'd interacted more with the seedlings than with his colleagues. But now he had no choice. He divided the refugees into groups. Those who could walk went to the ravine to look for worms. Those who could dig dug new plots. The children gathered stones and piled them up for future walls. The elderly, who could neither walk nor dig, sat by the well and wove ropes from the grass that the harvester had gathered beyond the village. Eileen worked beside him, silently, without asking questions, doing what he said. She dug holes for seeds, carried water, crumbled bone meal. Tobias came too. The old man groaned as he dropped to his knees and began pouring ash into the furrows. Dan demonstrated, explained. Ashes here, meal here, worms here, water in the morning and evening. Don't overwater. The soil should be moist but not wet. People listened. Not everyone understood, but they did it, because there were no other options. By evening, they had prepared 3 more plots, small ones, 1 meter by 1 meter each. But in the dead soil where nothing had grown for 100 years, every meter was a victory. Dan planted the remaining turnip seeds from Eileen's bag, 10 seeds, in each hole, with ash and flour and worms. He watered them. He didn't talk to them. He didn't have time. There weren't enough hours in the day. At night, he sat by the brown sprout. It had grown to 60 centimeters. The swelling on the stem had grown, the size of an apple, smooth, without blemishes. For now. A silvery hole lay nearby, empty, no sign of sprouting. Dan looked at it and thought. A minute of attention. 1 minute. He gave that seed a minute and called it enough. He felt ashamed. He leaned toward the hole, whispered, "I'll come tomorrow, and the day after. I won't forget." Then he lay down on the ground next to the brown sprout, closed his eyes. His body ached. His hands were rubbed raw. His back wouldn't straighten. He fell asleep in 3 seconds. Brown grain awoke on the 20th day. Not like harvest. No flash, no cracking bark, no golden light. Dan came in the morning to water it and saw that the sprout had disappeared. Someone was sitting in its place, on the ground, legs crossed, not tall, 5'3". A body of dark brown bark, smooth, without golden veins, broad hands with short, thick fingers, a simple face, round, with closed eyes. An inscription hung above him, Furrow, Rank C, Class, Plowman. Rank C. Dan stood and watched. C, not A, not B, C, because he had given this seed less time, less attention, fewer words. The difference was palpable. The reaper stood behind Dan. He looked at the newcomer. Furrow opened his eyes, brown, warm, calm, without the reaper's depth, without his intensity. Furrow looked at Dan, then at his hands. He turned his palms upward. He looked at his fingers, clenched them, unclenched them, then stood up, slowly, heavily, like a man getting up after a long sleep. He was stocky, solid, broad-shouldered, not a warrior, a laborer. Dan looked at him and said, "Hello, I've been waiting for you." Borozda tilted his head, opened his mouth. His voice was different. Not the creak of wood like the reapers, a dull, soft sound, like the earth striking a shovel. He said, "What to do?" Not father, not "what's the matter?" Just, "What should I do?" Dan understood. He had put work into that seed, calmness, simplicity, and he got what he put in. A creature that doesn't ask why, that asks what to do. Dan pointed to the field. He said, "Dig." Furrow nodded. He walked to the field, dropped to his knees, plunged his hands into the earth, and began to dig. Not like the reaper. The reaper tore at the earth, split the caked crust like bread. Furrow worked differently. He plunged his fingers in slowly, crumbled the clods. He sifted through it, removed stones, loosened it, methodically, evenly, without stopping. An hour later, he had prepared a 2 by 2 meter plot, perfectly even, perfectly loose. The earth beneath his hands became soft and dark, not as fast as under the reaper's feet, but deeper, more thoroughly. Dan watched and nodded. The reaper watched too. Then he walked over to Dan, stood beside him, spoke quietly. "He doesn't talk to me." Dan looked at him, asked if he'd tried. Harvester said he had, that he'd stood nearby and waited, that Furrow had looked at him and turned away. Dan understood. Harvester was born of pain and loneliness, of nighttime conversations, of Dan's tears that dripped onto the ground next to the seed. Furrow was born of something else, of calm explanations, of conversations about work, about water and furrows. They were different, like children from different families. Dan told the reaper, "Give him time. He'll find his words." The reaper nodded, but something remained in his eyes. Not jealousy, sadness. The quiet sadness of a being who wants to be understood by one made of the same stuff. And the silvery seed never sprouted. Dan came to him every evening. He spoke. 2 minutes, 3. He couldn't do more. Too much work, too many people, too few hours. The seed lay in the ground and was silent. 3 days after Furrow's awakening, food arrived. The first food from his plot. The grains had ripened. Dan couldn't believe his eyes. 3 weeks. From planting to harvest, 3 weeks. In his world, wheat ripens in 4 months, spelt in 5. Here, 3 weeks. The earth of this world worked differently, or his hands worked differently, or both. The harvest was small, 2 kilograms of grain from 12 sprouts, but the grain was real, full-bodied, heavy. He ground it between stones. He got flour, coarse, with bran, but flour. He mixed it with water, molded flatbreads, baked them on the hearth. 8 flatbreads, 47 people, 8 flatbreads. He went out to the village square, with the hearth, with the cauldron he'd found in one of the abandoned huts. The reaper brought water. The plowman brought roots he'd found while digging the earth. Wild, tough, but edible. Dan cooked soup, from the roots, from a handful of grain, from wild herbs that grew at the bottom of the ravine. He cooked it for 3 hours, stirred it, tasted it, added water, tasted it again. By evening, the soup was ready. Watery, pale, with a barely noticeable flavor, but hot and real. He poured it into bowls, clay ones, chipped ones, which he had gathered from all the huts, bowl by bowl. The harvester stood nearby and held a stack of bowls. Eileen handed out spoons. Dan approached each person, personally. He handed the bowl to them, looked them in the eyes, called them by name. Those whose names he knew, Tobias, Eileen. The woman with the little girl was named Nora. The girl was named Amy. The teenage refugee was named Kai. He remembered each one. They ate. Silently, quietly. Hot, pale soup made of roots and a handful of grains. And everyone ate as if it were the best soup of their lives, because for many, it was the first hot meal in a week. The village elder stood to the side, watching. Dan walked over to her, held out a bowl. She looked at the bowl, At him, at his hands, calloused and scraped. She took it, sat down on the step of her hut, brought it to her mouth, took a sip. Then she set the bowl on her lap and sat motionless. Her shoulders were shaking. Dan turned away. He didn't watch. Some things a person must go through without witnesses. Eileen stood next to the empty cauldron. She looked at her mother, then at Dan. There was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before, something warm and frightened at the same time, like a sprout breaking through the bark, not knowing if it will survive. At night, Dan sat alone. The harvester stood by the cabin. He dug a furrow. He dug at night, too. He didn't get tired. He just dug, methodically, steadily, like a machine. Dan looked at the silvery hole, empty, no sprout, no glow. 1 minute of attention. He gave it 1 minute and waited for a miracle. He leaned down, placed his palms on the ground around the hole, and began to speak. Not in a whisper, out loud. He spoke of the soup, about the bowls, about people's faces, about the village elder who cried, about the girl Amy who ate 3 spoonfuls and fell asleep in her mother's arms, about Kai, the teenager who, after eating, walked over to Barazda and stood silently beside him. Just stood there and watched him dig. Dan spoke for 20 minutes. Then he fell silent. The earth didn't glow. The seed was silent. He lay on his back and closed his eyes. Maybe not every seed sprouts. Maybe he did something wrong. Maybe 1 minute wasn't enough. He fell asleep right there, on the ground, next to the hole where the silent seed lay. At dawn, the harvester woke him. He touched his shoulder with wooden fingers. Dan opened his eyes. The harvester gestured. Dan sat up. He looked. From the silvery hole, a sprout was sticking out. Tiny, 3 centimeters, silvery white, thin as a thread, but alive. Dan looked at it and couldn't breathe. 20 minutes. 20 minutes of real conversation, not a hurried minute. 20 minutes about living people. That was enough. He reached out his hand, touched the sprout with his fingertip. The sprout swayed toward him, like the first one, like the harvester. Reached out to Dan. Dan smiled. He said, "There you are." They didn't speed up. Barazda worked without stopping. He dug in the morning. He dug in the afternoon. He dug at night. He didn't get tired. He didn't complain. He didn't talk. He just plunged his broad palms into the earth and loosened it, meter by meter. In a week, he prepared a plot 30 by 30 meters, huge by village standards. Dan planted it all: grains, turnips from Eileen's seeds, peas, alternating in rows, crop rotation in miniature, 3 crops, 3 rows, nothing in the 4th row, fallow, rest for the soil. The harvester walked the plot every day. His footsteps raised the pH, furrow loosened the soil. Dan planted and watered. Eileen helped. Tobias helped. Kai, a teenage refugee, followed furrow like a shadow. At first he just watched. Then he began to imitate him. He knelt down next to furrow and dug with his hands. The small, slender hands of a 15-year-old boy next to the broad, calloused palms of the grainkeeper. Furrow paid him no mind. Or perhaps he did. Dan noticed that on the 3rd day, Furrow began to dig a little slower. Just enough for Kai to keep up with him. A silvery sprout grew. Slowly. Slower than the harvester. Slower than Furrow. Dan came to see him every evening. 20 minutes, sometimes 30. He told him everything. About the day's work. About people. About how Nora smiled for the first time when she saw the green peas on the stakes. About how Amy, her daughter, got to her feet and ran across the plot. About how Tobias sat at the edge of the field and cried, looking at the sprouts. Quietly, without a sound. Just tears streaming down his wrinkled face, and he didn't wipe them away. The sprout listened. Dan couldn't explain it, but he felt it. The sprout listened. A swelling appeared on its stem on the 10th day. Small, silvery, without features. On the 12th day, Dan made it out. Not a face, 2 faces, 2 small growths next to each other. He didn't understand what it meant, but he didn't rush it. By the end of the 3rd week after the refugees arrived, what he had both waited for and feared happened. The grain on the large plot had ripened, all at once, in 3 weeks, just like the first harvest. 2 kilograms from the small plot were nothing, but the large plot, 30 by 30 meters. Dan stood at the edge and watched. Golden stalks swayed in the wind. There was almost no wind, but they swayed, as if they were breathing. Heavy ears of grain bent toward the ground, full, ripe. He walked into the field. He ran his hand over the ears of grain. Grains fell into his hand, large, heavy, more than the seeds from Cyrus's sacks. He estimated. 150 kilograms could be harvested from this plot, maybe 200. Enough to feed 47 people for 2 weeks. And then the turnips would ripen, then the peas, then he would sow the plot again. A cycle, a continuous cycle, just like in Iowa, only faster, much faster. He called everyone. The whole village came out into the field, 47 people. They stood and looked at the golden ears of grain. None of them had ever seen a harvest like this in their entire lives. Tobias fell to his knees. He scooped up a handful of grain, pressed it to his face. His shoulders were shaking. Nora was holding Amy in her arms, and the girl was reaching toward the ears of grain with her little fingers. Kai stood next to Barazda, shoulder to shoulder, a wooden shoulder and a human one. The village elder stood off to the side, as always, but this time she didn't turn away. She was looking at the field, at the golden field in the middle of the gray fields. And Dan saw her lips move silently. He didn't know what she was saying. Maybe she was praying. Maybe she was counting. Maybe she was just repeating that this was impossible. They had been harvesting all day, by hand. There were no sickles. There weren't enough knives. The reaper cut the stalks with a scythe, in one motion, cleanly, evenly. He was made for this. His name was made for this. The reaper, the one who reaps. The furrower gathered the cut stalks and piled them up. The people threshed. They beat the stalks with sticks to knock out the grain. Primitive, slow, but it worked. By evening, they had 170 kilograms of clean grain. Dan stood next to the sacks and counted. 170, 3.5 kilograms per person, for 2 weeks. Just enough. But just enough isn't starvation. Just enough is life. Eileen walked up to him. She stood beside him, silently. Then she said, "You promised the village elder 10 times as many sacks of grain, for a month." Dan looked at the sacks. 1 sack was about 20 kilograms. 10 sacks was 200. He had 170. He was 30 short. He smiled. The turnips would be ripe in a week. He'd give the village elder the turnips, and there would still be some left. Eileen looked at him, then at the field, at the flattened stalks, at the black, loose earth that a month ago had been a gray crust. She said quietly, "Grandma would be happy." Dan didn't answer. They stood side by side and looked at the field. The reaper stood behind them, silently. His yellow eyes glowed in the twilight like 2 little suns. At night, Dan sat by the silvery sprout. 20 days. The sprout had grown to 70 centimeters. The 2 swellings had become more distinct. 2 faces, side by side. One slightly larger than the other, both with their eyes closed. Dan looked at them and didn't understand. 2 faces, 1 seed. He placed his palm on the stem, warm, pulsing. But the pulse was strange. Double. Thump, thump. Pause. Thump, thump. 2 beats. 2 hearts. Dan removed his hand. He looked at the hollow, then at his palms, then back at the 2 faces. He whispered, "There are 2 of you." The sprout swayed. Both faces twitched, just a little. At the same time, both sets of lips quivered, as if both wanted to answer but couldn't. Dan closed his eyes. 2 grainers from a single seed. He didn't know what that meant, didn't know what to expect. He didn't know what rank they would receive. C, like furrow. Maybe D, maybe E. 1 minute of attention during planting, then 20 minutes a day for 3 weeks. Not too much, not too little, something in between. He opened his eyes and said, "I'll tell you a story. About a woman who was burned at the stake for loving the earth. About her granddaughter who hid seeds for 30 years. About a girl who planted a turnip and couldn't get up from her knees." He spoke for an hour. When he finished, the sprout had grown 2 centimeters. Both faces became clearer. 1 female, 1 male. He lay down beside it, closed his eyes. In the morning, a sound woke him. Distant, low. A rumble. Like a horn. He sat up. The reaper stood nearby. He was looking south. He had stopped digging the furrow. For the first time in 2 weeks, his hands were still. He, too, was looking south. A column of smoke was rising on the horizon. Black, thick, tall. Not just 1. 3 columns of smoke. 3 villages were burning at once. Zativa, Caedmon. Dan stood up. He looked at the smoke, then at his own village, at the sacks of grain, at the green field, at the people coming out of the huts and squinting toward the horizon, at the 47 faces he had fed yesterday from the cauldron. They were next. He knew it. The reapers were coming from the south, village after village, hamlet after hamlet. They were next. He turned to the silvery sprout, 2 faces, eyes closed. He needed time. He always needed time, and there was never enough time. Dan didn't wait. The morning after he saw the smoke, he gathered everyone in the village square. 47 people stood before him, their faces tense. They had seen the smoke too. They knew what it meant. Many of the refugees had lived through this once before. Nora held Amy close to her chest. Kai stood next to Barazda. Tobias sat on a rock and stared at the ground. Dan said that the smoke in the south was the reapers, that they were moving from south to north, that villages were burning one after another, that their village was in their path. He said they had a choice, to flee north to the fortress city of Valtron, or to stay. If they fled, it would be without grain, without fields, without everything they had grown. To arrive in Valtron destitute and starving. If they stayed, they would have to prepare. No one spoke. The silence was oppressive. Then Tobias stood up. The old man straightened his back. He looked at Dan, then at the field. At the green field he was seeing for the first time in his life. He said he wouldn't go anywhere, that he was 61 years old, that he'd lived his whole life on dead land, that for the first time in 61 years he was seeing living land, and that he'd die here if he had to. But he wouldn't leave. Nora looked at Amy, then at Dan. She said her daughter had nowhere to hide, that in Valtron, F-rank farmers weren't allowed inside the walls, that they'd have to live in a camp outside the walls, without a roof, without food. At least here there was soup. One by one, they spoke. Not everyone, but enough. We're staying. We're staying. We're staying. Dan listened and counted. Out of 47, 4 wanted to leave. 2 old men and 2 women without children. He nodded, said he'd give them some grain for the road. They left an hour later. 43. Dan turned to the reaper. Rank A. A scythe made of living vine, yellow eyes. Then to the furrower. Rank C. Wide palms, warm hazel eyes. 2 grainers, against a squad of reapers. He didn't know how many there would be. Maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 100. Ranks from B to S. Professional killers trained to destroy farming villages. 2 grainmen wouldn't be enough. He needed more. He walked toward the silvery sprout. 22 days, 2 faces, eyes closed. Not ready yet. When? He didn't know. Maybe in a day, maybe in a week, maybe in a month. He couldn't rush it. To rush meant to kill. He stood up. He thought. Then he made a decision that tormented him all the next night. He went to the ravine. He searched all day. From morning until dark. He turned over every stone, crawled through every crevice, found 7 seeds. Not golden, not silvery, ordinary, dark gray, small, with a thin shell, weak. He brought them to the village. He prepared 7 holes. Quickly, bone meal, ash, worms, water. He planted all 7, one after another. He said one phrase to each, just one. You were born to protect this village. One phrase, 1 minute of attention. The earth flickered 7 times, faintly, barely noticeable. 7 faint flashes. 7 seeds. 7 future seedlings. What rank? E. Maybe F. 1 minute and 1 phrase, minimum. But Dan knew something. Quantity matters too. 1 SSS-RANK grainer is strong. But 40 F-rankers standing shoulder to shoulder and unafraid to die. That's strength too, a different kind, but strength. The reaper stood nearby and watched. 7 holes, 7 seeds, 7 future brothers, or sisters. Dan saw his eyes, saw how they darkened to shade. Jealousy, quiet, familiar. Dan didn't try to comfort him. There was no time. Then he did something else. He went to the field, to the large plot. He sowed it again, completely. All the seeds that were left. Grains, turnips, peas. If the harvest ripened again in 3 weeks, they would have food. If not, he didn't think about if not. For the next 5 days he worked 20 hours a day, slept 4 hours.
20 hours working. He fed the silvery sprout with conversations. He checked on the 7 gray sprouts. They hatched on the second day. All 7, small, gray, thin, identical.
Like soldiers in formation. He watered them. He spoke one phrase to each one every day. The same one. You don't have to be strong. Just stand by my side. Eileen worked with him, from dawn till dusk. She no longer asked why. She saw the smoke. She understood everything. On the 3rd day after planting the gray seeds, she asked him. They'll die. Not a question, a statement. She meant the gray ones, the weak ones, the E or F rank grainers he'd grown in a hurry, whom he'd throw into battle against the S rank reapers. Dan didn't answer. Because she was right. Because he knew some of them would die. Maybe all of them. And each would be a face he'd seen, a name he'd given, even if just for a minute, even just one phrase. But he had given them that, and that was enough to hurt. Eileen looked at him, then at the gray sprouts, then back at him. She said, "Teach me." Dan looked at her. She said, "Teach me to water them, to talk to them, to care for them. I want to help." Dan shook his head. He explained, if someone else cares for them instead of him, the sprout will die. That's just how it is. He didn't know why. But he knew for sure. Only his hands, only his voice, only his attention. Eileen clenched her fists, then unclenched them, nodded, then said, "Then I'll do everything else. Carry water, grind grain, cook meals, repair the huts, so you can focus only on them." Dan looked at her stubborn eyes, at her tight lips, at her hands calloused in dirt. He nodded. On the 5th day, the silvery sprout cracked. Dan heard the sound in the morning, a dry snap, like a branch breaking. He ran over. The stem was splitting in 2. It wasn't breaking, it was splitting. The 2 stems were spreading apart, like a slingshot, like 2 tree trunks growing from a single root, a face on each stem, one female, one male, both with their eyes closed, both silvery white. The bark was thin, almost transparent. Something pulsed beneath it. 2 hearts, 2 rhythms, not in sync, one slightly faster than the other. Dan sat in front of the forked stem and waited. He didn't rush it. He didn't whisper. He just sat and waited. They awoke at sunset, simultaneously. The bark opened like a clamshell. No flash, no light, quietly. A figure emerged from the left stem. A figure emerged, small, 4 feet tall, female. A body of silvery white bark, slender, fragile. A soft face, gray eyes, clear. They opened and immediately found Dan. An inscription hung above her. Vine, rank D, class healer. A second figure emerged from the right stem, just as small, 4 feet 4 inches, male. A sturdier body. The bark slightly darker, silvery with a blue tint. A sharp face, eyes just as gray. Above him, root, rank D, class, scout. 2 grainlings, D rank, from a single seed, healer and scout. Dan watched them. They stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and the first thing they did, they turned toward each other, looked into each other's eyes, and took each other's hands. Then they turned to Dan. Loza opened her mouth. Her voice was soft, like the rustling of leaves. She said,
"Hello, we've heard your stories, all of them."
Dan swallowed. All of them. Every evening, every story, about people, about food, about Grandma Eileen, about bowls of soup, about Tobias who cried looking at the sprouts. They heard everything, not alone, together. 1 seed, 2 souls. He held out his hands. They stepped toward him. Both silvery palms rested in his, warm, light, like feathers. He said, "Hello, I've been waiting for you." The root bowed his head. Then he said, "Father, the smoke in the south is closer." Dan didn't turn around. He knew. 7 gray shoots behind him poked out of the ground, small, thin, barely alive. The reaper stood by the hut. He was digging a furrow. Vine and root held his hands. 43 people waited in the huts. The smoke in the south was getting closer. There was less time than he needed, as always. Root went out on a reconnaissance mission the very first night. Dan didn't ask him to. Root said he sensed movement to the south and wanted to check it out. Dan nodded. Root vanished into the darkness, literally. His silvery blue bark darkened to the color of the earth, and he disappeared, as if he had never been there. Vine stayed behind,
She stood by the silver stump from which they had emerged and looked in the direction her brother had gone. Dan approached her. He asked if everything was all right. She replied that she could sense him, always, no matter what happened. They were one seed, one root system. Dan remembered that. Root returned before dawn. He came silently. He stood before Dan and spoke. His voice was even, emotionless, like a report. 2 villages to the south have been completely destroyed. A third is burning. A detachment of 23 men, led by a rider on a 6-legged beast, S rank. The rest range from B to A. They're moving north, on foot. They'll be here in 4 days. Dan listened and counted. 23. 1 S rank. The rest are B and A. Against them, an A rank reaper, a C rank furrow, a D rank vine and root, and 7 gray sprouts who aren't ready. The math is simple. Hopeless. He asked Root how many people they'd killed in the villages. Root said, everyone. Dan closed his eyes. Everyone. Farmers, old people, children, everyone. Because Lord Caedmon believed that weak blood diluted humanity. Because F ranks aren't people. They're expendable. Low-grade livestock. He opened his eyes. He looked at the gray sprouts. 10 days. They had been growing for 10 days. The tallest was 30 centimeters. The shortest was 20. 2 had developed buds. The other 5 were just stems. Thin, pale. They need another week. Maybe 2. He has 4 days. He went to the reaper. The reaper was standing by the hut, looking south. Dan stood beside him. He asked quietly, "Can you stop an S rank?" The reaper was silent. Then he said, "I don't know. I haven't tried." Dan nodded. A versus S. Theoretically, a 1-rank difference. Practically, a chasm. The system didn't assign ranks linearly. Each subsequent rank wasn't 10% stronger. It was orders of magnitude. Tens of times stronger. An S rank could kill 10 A ranks, or 20, or 1. It depended on the specific people, on their skills, on their experience. The Reaper was strong, but he'd existed for less than a month. He had no combat experience. He'd never fought a single time. Dan made 3 decisions. First, he stopped sleeping. Completely. 4 days without sleep. Cyrus's body was young, 19 years old. It would hold up. Every hour he used to spend sleeping now went to the gray sprouts. He sat next to each one at a time. 10 minutes per sprout. 7 sprouts. An hour and 10 minutes per round. 4 rounds per night. He spoke to each one. Not a single phrase. A story. Short but true. To the first, he told the story of Tobias, of the old man who had lived on dead land for 60 years and saw greenery for the first time. To the second, he told the story of Nora and Amy, of the mother who carried her daughter for 4 days across the wasteland and never once stopped. To the third, he told the story of Kay, about a boy who dug the earth next to the furrow and never once complained. To the fourth, he told the story of Eileen, about a girl who saw her grandmother's field burn and was afraid to touch a seed for 30 years. To the fifth, he told the story of the town clerk, about a woman who broke but not completely, who cried over a bowl of soup. To the sixth, he told the story of himself, about an agronomist from Iowa who talked to the corn and died on I-80. The seventh, he told the seventh nothing. He just sat down next to him and cried. Not out of self-pity, out of exhaustion, out of fear. From the realization that in 4 days these sprouts, to which he had given names and stories, would rise from the ground and go to die for people they had seen only through his words. Tears dripped onto the ground next to the 7th sprout. The earth absorbed them. The sprout swayed toward him, as always. The second decision. He asked Eileen to gather all the residents who could hold a stick in their hands, not for battle, for evacuation. If the reapers break through the grain people, if things go wrong, the women and children must flee north, to Valtran, with the grain, with everything they can carry. Eileen nodded. She didn't argue. She understood what that meant, that he wasn't including himself on the list of those fleeing. She asked, "What about you?" Dan said he would stay. Eileen clenched her fists. Her hands were shaking. She said she would stay too. Dan looked at her. He wanted to object. He didn't. She had the right to choose. The third option. He went to the village elder. He came to her hut. He stood at the door. She opened it. She looked at him. He said that in 4 days the reapers would come, that they would burn the village, that he needed her help. The elder was silent. Then she asked, "What kind?" Dan said, "Tell me about Eileen's grandmother, about the Greenbloods, about everything you know and have been hiding for 30 years. The village elder turned pale. She took a step back. Dan stood and waited. She was silent for a long time. Then she sat down on the step. She lowered her head and began to speak. The Greenbloods, the order of the Druid agronomists. They existed for thousands of years before the schism. They knew how to do what Dan does, plant seeds and grow creatures from them. Warriors, healers, scouts, guardians. They didn't fight themselves. They raised those who fought, and those who fed, and those who healed. They were the foundation of the world. When the schism occurred and the heavenly judgment system emerged, the Greenbloods were declared enemies. Because their creatures received ranks without the system's consent. Because a farmer could create an SSS warrior. And that shattered the entire hierarchy, the entire pyramid, the entire power structure. They were wiped out in a single generation, all of them. Except for a few families who hid in distant villages. Grandma Eileen was one of them, the last one. The village elder fell silent. Then she raised her head, looked at Dan, and said, "I knew you were a Greenblood from the very first day, when you planted the seed and the earth glowed. I knew. And I called the inspector because I was scared, because I remembered what happened to my husband's mother, because I was afraid they'd burn everyone because of you." She fell silent. Then she said more quietly, "I was wrong." Dan sat down next to her on the step, silently. They sat side by side, the village elder and the farmer. Two F-rank bugs on the edge of a world that wanted to destroy them. Then Dan stood up. He thanked her and went to his sprouts. 3 days. 3 days to raise an army. Not an army, a family. 7 sprouts, 4 grainmen, 43 people, and 1 green field he wouldn't give up. The gray sprouts awoke on the 3rd day, not all at once, one by one. The first stood up at dawn, small, 5 feet 4, gray bark, a simple face, expressionless. Above it, rank E, class militia. In his hand, a stick made of vine, not a scythe, not a sword, a stick. The second one an hour later, the same, 5 feet 4 inches, E rank, militia. The third by noon, the fourth after lunch, the fifth by evening, the sixth at night. All E rank, all militiamen, all small, all with sticks. Dan stood before the 6 gray figures and looked at them. They stood in a row, almost identical, but not quite. The first's shoulders were slightly broader, the second's legs were longer, the third's arms were stronger. Each received a story, each had absorbed it, and each had become slightly different. The first, the one to whom he had told about Tobias, Dan called him Stem. The second, about Nora and Amy, Ear. The third, about Kai, Cutting. The fourth, about Eileen, Ovary. The fifth, about the village headman, the seedbed. The sixth, about himself, the harvest. 6 E-rank militiamen with sticks, against 23 B and A-rank assassins and 1 S-rank. Dan wasn't laughing. He didn't find it funny. The 7th sprout, the one to whom he didn't tell a story, to whom he simply cried. He hadn't woken up. He stood there, silent. The swelling on the stem was large, his face was distinct, but his eyes were closed. Dan sat next to him, the last night. Tomorrow the reapers would be here. He placed his palms on the stem, warm. His pulse was fast, strong, stronger than the rest of the grays. Dan whispered, "I don't know who you will be. I've given you only tears, I have nothing else." The sprout swayed. Vigorously, as if from a gust of wind, but there was no wind. At dawn, Dan stood on the southern edge of the village. Behind him lay the field, a green field with golden ears of grain that were nearly ripe, the second harvest. Beyond the field were huts, 43 people in the huts. Before him lay the wastelands, a gray infinity, and dust on the horizon. They were coming. The reaper stood to Dan's right, a scythe in his hand, his eyes brighter than usual, golden, burning. Furrow stood to his left, unarmed, broad palms clenched into fists. It was the first time Dan had seen his fists clenched. Vine and Root stood behind Dan. Vine with slender silver hands that glowed with a soft green light. The healer. Root was almost invisible. His bark changed color, blending in with the earth. 6 gray militiamen stood in a row, small, thin, with sticks. Stem, ear, cuttings, ovary. Threshing floor. Harvest. 10 grainmen, 1A, 1C, 2D, 6E. Dan stood among them. Rank F, class farmer, level 1. His level hadn't changed. Not by a single point. The system looked at him and saw trash. Dust on the horizon was approaching. An hour later, Dan saw them. Figures. Dark. In identical black armor bearing the caveman crest. A sickle on a red field. They marched in perfect formation. 22 infantrymen. At the front, mounted on a six-legged beast, a rider. Large, broad-shouldered, towering over them. Isaac Corvin. Rank S. Class. Reaper Captain. S-Rank. Captain. Caedmon's right-hand man. Dan read that name and felt Cyrus's body grow cold. Not his fear, the body's fear. Ancient, hammered into the bones by generations. The fear of an F-rank before an S-rank, like a mouse before a hawk. He clenched his teeth, stood straighter. Corvin rode closer, stopped 50 paces away, surveyed the line. 10 figures of bark and wood. One man in a tattered shirt. His face expressed nothing. Absolute zero emotion. A professional. He spoke. His voice was steady, deep. He said he'd been informed of an anomaly in this area, that he'd come to conduct a standard sweep, that the farmer had 10 seconds to step aside, and then he would die quickly. Dan didn't step aside. Corvin shrugged, raised his hand. 22 reapers moved forward. Dan turned to the reaper. He said one word. Stop. The reaper didn't move. Dan turned to the rest. He said, stop. Everyone stood still. Corvin lowered his hand. The reapers stopped. Corvin watched. He waited. He didn't understand. Dan stepped forward. Alone, unarmed, without rank, without anything. He approached Corvin 30 paces away. 20, 15. He stopped. He looked up. Corvin on his beast was 2 meters taller. Dan said, I have grain, 400 kilograms. I'll give it all to you. Take the grain and leave. Corvin was silent. Then he smirked, with one corner of his mouth. He said he didn't need the grain, that his job wasn't to plunder but to clean up, that the harvest wasn't a war, it was sanitation. Dan stood there, looking up at him. Then he nodded, turned around, walked back toward the line. With every step, his back braced for a blow. It didn't come. Corvin didn't attack from behind. A professional, the rules. Dan returned to his own. He stood between the reaper and furrow. He looked at each of them, at the reaper's yellow eyes, at furrow's brown ones, at vine and root's gray ones, at the empty, identical eyes of the 6 gray ones, at the closed eyes of the 7th sprout who stood rooted in the ground behind them. He spoke quietly so that only they could hear. I don't want you to die, not a single one of you. But if it comes to that, not for me. For the field behind us, for the people in the huts, for the soup in the cauldron, for Eileen's turnip, for harvest's peas, for furrow's furrows, for the stories I've told you, for the fact that you exist. Harvest raised his scythe. Furrow clenched his fists tighter. Vine stepped closer to root. The 6 grays raised their sticks. Dan stepped behind the line. Corvin raised his hand, lowered it. The reapers struck in a wedge formation, 10 in the center, 6 on the right, 6 on the left. Corvin stayed put. He watched. The grays took the first blow, stem, ear, stalk. 3 E-rank militiamen against 10 A and B-rank assassins. The stalk withstood 2 blows. The reaper's sword cut into his shoulder. The bark cracked. Gray splinters flew in all directions. The stalk did not retreat. He intercepted the staff and struck the reaper in the chest, weakly. E-rank against A-rank, like a child against an adult. The reaper didn't even flinch. He struck again. Stem fell. Ear rushed to help. He took a blow to the side. He collapsed nearby. Cutting stood before them, legs spread wide, stick held high. 3 reapers were coming for him. He knew he wouldn't hold out. Dan saw it in his eyes. Empty gray eyes in which a single thought burned. Just stand by my side. The sapling stood for 4 seconds. Then he fell. But those 4 seconds were enough. The reaper crashed into the center. The scythe whistled. The vine swung in an arc and sliced through the 3 reapers in a single motion. It didn't kill them. It sliced them. Their armor burst open. Their bodies flew 10 paces away. They stood up, but slowly, with difficulty. A-rank. The reaper's scythe pierced A-rank armor. Dan saw it and believed it for a second. On the right flank, Zaviaz and Palova stood against 6 reapers. 2 small gray figures with sticks. They didn't attack. They just stood there, blocking the passage to the village. 6 reapers hacked at them. Zaviaz lost an arm in the second minute. The stick fell. He picked it up with his remaining arm. He stood. Palova took a blow to the chest. The bark cracked all the way to the core. Dan saw the white pith beneath the gray bark, like wood. Palova fell to one knee. Then he stood up. He stood there, On the left flank, Genevieve stood alone. 6 reapers were advancing on him. The 6th gray one, the one Dan had told about himself, about the quiet grape grower from Iowa. Genevieve didn't raise his staff. He thrust it into the ground, and the earth around him sank 10 paces. The reapers stumbled. 2 fell into the pit. Genevieve leaped onto one of the fallen. E against B, hopeless, but in the pit, in the ground, where the reaper couldn't swing. Genevieve held him for 3 seconds. Then the 2nd reaper climbed out and struck from above. Genevieve split in 2. Dan saw it. He saw the gray body split into 2 halves, how the stick remained stuck in the ground, how the eyes went dark. He didn't scream. He couldn't. His throat tightened, but his hands moved. He was already running, toward the field, toward the 7th sprout, the one that hadn't awakened. He ran and screamed. Not words, sound, just sound. The cry of a man losing what he had grown. The battle raged. The reaper struck. The scythe sang. 4 A-rank reapers lay on the ground, alive but unable to rise. 3 more had retreated. The reaper was closing in on them. His golden eyes burned. But there were 22 reapers, and the reaper was a single A-rank. Borozda fought on the right flank, unarmed, with his fists. C-rank against B-rank. He was losing, slowly. His bark was cracking in 10 places. Brown splinters flew like shavings. But every time he fell, he got back up. He got up and clenched his fists again. The root emerged from beneath the ground. It grabbed the reapers by the legs, dragged them half a step down. For a second. For 2. Long enough for Borozda to land a blow, not long enough to decide the fight. The vine stood in the rear. Her hands glowed green. Every time a gray militiaman fell, she reached out her hands and green light flowed across the ground toward him. The bark fused together, slowly. Not completely, but enough for Stem to stand up, for Ear to raise his staff, for Cuttings to block the passage again. A D-rank healer, weak, slow, but the only reason the Greys were still standing. Dan ran up to the 7th sprout, fell to his knees, gripped the stem with both hands. It was burning, not warm, hot. Its pulse was frantic, fast, like a drumbeat. His face flushed, eyes closed, lips pressed tight. Dan leaned toward him, toward this sprout to whom he had given only tears. He whispered, "I don't know who you are. I don't know what you'll become. But there, behind my back, the stalk stands without a hand. The ear is all cracked. The stalk fell 3 times and got up 3 times. The ovary holds the passage with one hand. The stalk stands with a hole in its chest. The stubble is dead." He fell silent. His voice broke. Then he continued, "I cried when I planted you. Not out of weakness, because I couldn't keep up, because I couldn't give you more. You got the least of all. 1 minute, 1 night of tears. But if you can hear me, if you're there, get up, please." The earth shook. Hard. So hard that Dan was thrown backward. The sprout's stem burst. It didn't bloom like a flower. It exploded. Shards of bark flew in all directions. Light burst from the ground. Not gold, not green. White. Blindingly white. Everyone stopped. The reapers, the grainmen. Even Corvin raised his hand to shield his eyes. A figure rose from the white light. Tall, taller than the reaper, 6 feet 4. A body of white bark, pure, smooth, like porcelain. Not a single golden streak, not a single pattern, just white. A face, open eyes, white, completely white. No pupils. An inscription flashed above the figure. Dan read it. His heart stopped. Tier. Rank S, class keeper. S rank. From the seed to which he had given 1 minute and 1 night of tears. S rank, like Corvin. Tier didn't move. He stood. White eyes looked at Dan. Then it slowly turned toward the battlefield, toward the cracks and splinters and blood and bodies, toward the gray militiamen who stood there because they didn't know how to do otherwise. Tier took a step. The ground beneath its foot didn't crack. It smoothed out, like water. Smooth. Even. It took a second step. A third. He walked toward the reapers, unarmed. No scythe, no staff, empty white hands. Corvin jumped down from the beast. For the first time in the entire battle, he drew his sword, long, black. He said, "Nothing personal, farmer, just clearing the field." Tier stopped in front of him. White eyes stared at the black sword. Then Tier raised his hand, opened his palm, and light flowed from his palm. White, warm. The light fell to the ground, spread across the ground like water, reached the gray militiamen, reached stem without a hand. The hand grew back, not slowly, instantly. Gray bark shot out from his shoulder and formed a new arm in 2 seconds. To the ear and the cracks closed. To the shoot, to the ovary, to the stalk with a hole in its chest. The hole closed up. The white flesh was covered with new bark. The light flowed on. It reached the furrow. Its cracks closed. The brown bark grew darker, stronger. The furrow straightened, clenched his fists. Something new appeared in his hazel eyes. The light reached the reaper. The scythe in the reaper's hands flashed, golden, bright. The vine from which it was made trembled and lengthened by half a meter. The reaper looked at his scythe, then at the tear. In his yellow eyes was an expression Dan had never seen before, gratitude. Corvin watched this. The sword in his hand trembled, not from fear, from understanding. He was a professional. He saw the balance of power. S versus S is a stalemate, plus an A-rank reaper with a reinforced scythe, plus a restored army. His reapers had been defeated. 4 lay dead, 3 were wounded. Corvin gripped his sword. He stepped forward. He was a reaper. He did not retreat. Tyr stood and looked at him. White eyes, empty and full at the same time.
Then Tyr did what no one expected. He sat down, on the ground, right in front of Corvin, crossed his legs, placed his palms on his knees, and closed his eyes. The ground around him began to turn green, not slowly, right now. Grass, real green grass sprouted from the gray, dead crust, within a radius of 10 steps, 20, 50. The greenery spread like a wave. Corvin stood with his sword over the seated Zernovic and watched as the earth beneath his feet came to life. As a sprout broke through a crack, as the gray crust turned into black, loose soil, he lowered his sword. He didn't sheath it. He just lowered it. He stood. He watched. 22 reapers stood. They watched. The green grass, the living earth, the white figure with closed eyes who sat and breathed, and with every exhalation the world around her came to life. Corvin turned, mounted his beast, raised his hand. The reapers gathered the wounded, formed a line. Corvin looked at Dan, across the field, through the greenery, across the line of grainers. He said, "We'll be back." He turned and led the squad south. Dan stood and watched them go. Then his legs gave way and he sat down on the ground, right on the grass, on the green grass growing from the dead earth. Eileen ran up to him, grabbed him by the shoulders, shook him, called his name. He didn't answer. He looked at the harvest. At the spot where the gray body lay, split in 2. A stick jutted out of the ground. Grass grew around it, green, bright, alive. Dan closed his eyes. 1 tear, a second, a third. Eileen stopped shaking him. She hugged him, silently. The reaper approached. He stood nearby, furrow, vine and root, 6 gray ones, 5, P5 gray ones. Tyr sat on the ground and breathed. The grass grew. For 3 days after the battle, Dan buried the harvest. Not right away. The first day he just sat next to the split body. He didn't move. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. Eileen brought him water. He didn't take it. The reaper stood nearby, silent. Furrow dug the grave. Without being asked, he just came and started digging, with his broad palms, slowly, carefully, as if loosening the soil for sowing. On the second day, Dan stood up. He gathered both halves of Zhnevia's body, heavy. The gray bark had already darkened, lost its color, became just a tree, a dead tree. He laid both halves in the pit that Furrow had dug. He placed a stick nearby, that very one, the one that Zhnevia had stuck into the ground before his death. The one that had created the pit that had brought down the 2 reapers, the one that had given him 3 extra seconds. Dan stood over the grave. Everyone had gathered. 43 people, 10 grainmen, 9 alive, 1 dead. Dan spoke, not a speech, not a farewell. He told them who Zhnevio was, the 6th of 7, the one to whom he had told his own story, about the agronomist from Iowa, about corn and soybeans, about I-80, about the headlights of an oncoming truck. Zhnevio absorbed that story, became part of it. And when he stuck the stick into the ground, he did what Dan would have done. Used the earth, not as a weapon, as a tool, as the only thing he knew. Dan fell silent, filled in the grave, with his hands, slowly, handful by handful. When he finished, he planted a seed in the mound, an ordinary one, a grain, from the last bag. He watered it. He didn't say anything to it. He just watered it. Then he stood up and went to work. In the evening, Eileen came to him. He was sitting by the field. A green field that had become even greener after what Tyr had done. Grass covered the ground 200 meters around the village. Real grass. Soft. Alive. Dan looked at her but didn't see her. Eileen sat down next to him. She was silent for a moment. Then she said that the turnip had grown, that she'd gone to check on it, that a turnip had grown from the seed she'd planted 3 weeks ago. An ordinary one, small, crooked, but real. Dan turned to her.
She was holding the turnip in her hands, a small, crooked yellow turnip with dirt on its skin. Her hands were trembling. Her eyes were shining. She said, "Grandma would be happy." Dan looked at the turnip, at the small, crooked turnip in the hands of the girl who, for 30 years, had been afraid to touch a seed. He reached out his hand. She handed him the turnip. He turned it over in his hands, sniffed it, took a bite. Raw, sweet, crunchy. Just an ordinary turnip. No magic, no glow, just a turnip. He laughed, quietly, hoarsely, then louder. Eileen looked at him and didn't understand. Then she started laughing too. They sat at the edge of the field, 2 F-rank farmers, and they laughed, at the turnip. The reaper stood nearby and didn't understand. He tilted his head, with that movement of his, like a dog, and it was so absurd. A 2-meter-tall warrior made of bark with a scythe on his shoulder tilting his head as he watched 2 people laughing at a root vegetable. Dan laughed until he cried, or cried until he laughed. He couldn't tell himself. Then he stood up, wiped his face, looked at Eileen. She was looking at him, with that look, warm and frightened, like a sprout pushing through the bark. He said to her, "Thank you." She nodded, turned away, quickly, as always when she didn't want to show her face. Dan looked at the field, at the village, at the huts, at the people, at the Zernoviks. Corvin said he would return, with a large force, with greater power, perhaps with Caedmon himself. Dan couldn't wait, couldn't sit still, couldn't grow here forever. A single green field in the middle of the endless wastes. A single oasis. A single dot on the map that sooner or later they would find and wipe out. He had to move, grow, not upward, outward. He gathered everyone the next morning, 43 people, 9 grainmen. He said the village was no longer safe, that the reapers would return, that staying meant waiting for death. He proposed something else. A caravan. They would leave, all together, people and grainmen, with grain, with seeds, with tools. They would head east, across the wastelands, and wherever they stopped, he would plant. To revive the land, to grow food, to leave green patches in the middle of the gray desert. Not just one oasis, 10, 20, 100. A trail that can't be erased because it's everywhere. Tobias asked what would happen when Caedmon sent an army after them. Dan answered, "I'll plant faster than they can burn." Silence. Then Nora stood up, Amy in her arms. She said, "I'm going." Kai stood up, silently, as always. He stood next to Furrow. Tobias grunted, got up from the rock, said that at 61 it's too late to start being afraid. One by one, everyone stood up. 43. Even the elder. She stood to the side, as always, but she stood. Dan nodded, turned to Harvest. He was looking at him. Yellow eyes burned. Dan said, "Let's go." The reaper nodded.
He hoisted his scythe onto his shoulder. Furrow clenched his fists. Vine took root by the hand. 5 gray militiamen raised their sticks. Tyr opened his wide eyes. He stood up. For the first time since the battle, the ground beneath him was green, thick, alive. He took a step. The grass stretched out behind him, like a trail, a green trail on the gray earth. Dan picked up 3 new seeds from Żniwi's grave. They had sprouted overnight from the grain he had planted on the mound. Not ordinary grains, seeds, heavy, with a thick shell. Dan held them in his hand and felt their pulse. New. From the grave of the old. Life from death. He put them in a pouch on his belt. The caravan set off at dawn. 43 people, 9 grainmen, sacks of grain, seeds, tools, and 1 F-rank farmer with a small pouch of seeds on his belt. They were leaving the village he had brought back to life, leaving behind a green field, golden ears of grain, grass, living earth. Someone will find it.
Someone will come and see what the earth can yield, and understand, and maybe try it themselves. Dan walked on without looking back. Sles walked last. The grass stretched out behind him, a green road through the gray wastelands. A year had passed. The caravan had become more than a group of refugees. 213 people. 3 10-1 grain bearers. 4 generations of seeds. Dan sat on the wagon and watched the column that stretched for half a kilometer. The reaper walked ahead, scythe on his shoulder, yellow eyes on the horizon. He hadn't changed, still the same. 2 meters tall, black bark, golden grain. The first, the beloved, the one who called him father. Walking beside the reaper was Caroline Ashford, a former knight of Caedmon's army, rank A. She had come to them 4 months ago, alone, without armor. With a sword she stuck into the ground in front of Dan and said she wouldn't kill farmers anymore. Dan asked what she would do. She replied, "What do you say?" he said. "Teach my grainmen to fight." She taught, for 4 months. Harvestmen, furrow, the 5 grays, the new ones Dan had raised on the road. She was tough, demanding, spoke little, fought a lot. Her dry soldier's humor frightened the gray militiaman and delighted Reaper. Once she told Reaper that his stance was crooked. Reaper tilted his head, with that same movement. Caroline smiled for the first time in 4 months. It wasn't a smile. It was a barely noticeable trembling curve of her lips. Dan saw it. He understood. She had a younger brother, an F rank. She killed him during training when she was 16. She was ordered to clear the line. She never forgave herself. Dan raised Zernovic, a little one, an E rank. He named him after her brother, not as a replacement, but as a promise that no one else with that name would die in vain. When Caroline saw the inscription above his head, she stood there for a minute. She didn't move.
Then she knelt before Zernovic and pressed his palm to her forehead. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Minso Che had found them 3 months ago. A wandering herbalist, half from the eastern lands. She had followed the green trail left by Tyr. She had walked for a week. She found the caravan. She saw Dan. She saw him crouching by the seed and talking to it. And she turned pale. She knew. Her grandmother had been one of the last Greenbloods. Minsu had spent her whole life looking for someone who could bring her grandmother's recipes back to life. Recipes from an old book with faded pages. Infusions, decoctions, composts, mixtures that heal the earth. She had tried them herself, dozens of times. Nothing worked, because the recipes required an ingredient that didn't exist. A grain grown by a Greenblood. Dan gave her a grain from his field. She brewed the first decoction according to her grandmother's recipe, poured it onto the dead earth. The earth came to life in an hour. Not in 3 weeks, in an hour. Minsu knelt and watched the green grass sprouting from the gray crust. Then she opened the book. Then she looked at Dan. Then she said quietly, "Grandmother was calling you." Dan didn't understand. Minsu explained. Before she died, her grandmother performed a ritual. She called out through the stars to the one who remembers the earth. She searched all the worlds. She searched for a person whose heart was like that of the Greenblood. She found a quiet agronomist from Iowa who talked to seeds. Dan sat and listened. The world swayed. He hadn't ended up in this body by accident. He had been called. An old woman dying on the edge of a dead world had called him through the stars because he talked to corn in the greenhouses of Iowa. Because his heart was in the right place. Because he knew how to love what grows. Minsu looked at him. In her eyes was silence, and tenderness, and sorrow, and gratitude. All at once. Dan reached out his hand. She took it. They sat in silence. 2 people, bound by a woman neither of them knew personally. A grandmother who had called a stranger to save the world. Taehyun had found them herself, the 17-year-old oracle. She had run away from the guild when she learned that her superiors were planning an operation to destroy the caravan. She came at night, small, skinny, with huge eyes and a habit of asking questions at the most inopportune moments. Dan gave her a task, to grow a flower, not for battle, not for food, just a flower. For 3 months they fiddled with the seed.
She watered it. He adjusted it. She asked why. He said because it's beautiful. She didn't understand. Then she did. When the flower bloomed, white with blue veins, she sat in front of him and was silent. For the first time in her life, she was silent not because she had nothing to say, because words were superfluous. Lyra Duval had come to buy him, the Baron's daughter, 22 years old, graceful, sarcastic, with a barbed remark in every other sentence. She arrived with bodyguards and a purse full of gold. Dan met her by the fire that evening. She began talking about political alliances and strategic partnerships. He asked, "Have you had dinner?" She fell silent. He pushed a bowl of stewed vegetables. She sat down, tried some, fell silent for a long time. A week later, she sent her guards back to her father. She stayed. Hannah's son arrived last, a blacksmith, 26 years old, a woman of few words. Her husband and son had died 3 years ago during a reaper's raid. She forged tools, hoes, sickles, shovels. Then Dan asked her to forge a scythe for the reaper, a real one, out of metal. Hannah forged for 3 days, without a break. When she finished, she brought the scythe out at dawn. The reaper stood and waited. She handed him the scythe. He took it, turned it over, tried it on. Then he looked at Hannah, he bowed his head, and said, "Mom." Hannah dropped the hammer. She stood there. Then she sank to her knees. The reaper knelt down beside her, 2 meters of black bark and golden grain. He knelt before the little blacksmith woman and waited. Hannah embraced him, pressed her face against the bark. For the first time in 3 years, she wept. The caravan moved on, day after day, village after village, wasteland after wasteland. Everywhere they stopped, Dee planted. The rain fell and brought the earth to life. Minsu brewed potions from her grandmother's recipes. Borozda loosened the soil. Jatvenik stood guard. Caroline taught. Tehi kept count. Lyra negotiated with the towns that didn't want to let them in and then didn't want to let them leave. Hannah forged. Eileen was there, always. From the first day, from the first turnip. She wasn't the strongest. She wasn't the smartest. She wasn't the prettiest. But she was the first, like the reaper. And Dan knew what that meant. A year later, the caravan reached Valtron, the fortress city. 40,000 people behind the walls. Varan Talt was waiting for them at the gates. Carts stood beside him, empty. He said, "The grain ran out yesterday." Dan looked at the walls, at the 40,000 hungry people behind them, then at his caravan, at the sacks of grain, at the seeds, at the 31 grainmen, at the reaper and the furrow and the vine and the root and the tear and the 5 grays and all the new ones he'd raised along the way. At the 6 women standing beside him, each with her own pain, each with her own story, each having found in this caravan what she'd been looking for. He said to Varan, "I need a field. Anyone. The deadest one you have." Varan nodded. By evening, Dan was standing in a field outside the walls of Valtron, gray, dead, just like the first one, just like the one where he'd woken up on the first day. He dropped to his knees. He took a seed from the pouch on his belt, one of the 3 that had sprouted on Zneviu's grave. He placed it in the hole, covered it with soil, watered it, whispered, "Come on, little one, let's try again." The earth glowed. The story continued. Then came the 2nd year, and the 3rd, and the war with Caedmon, which was won not by the sword, but by the plow. Because when Caedmon led his army to Valtron, he didn't see a fortress, he saw fields. Green fields stretching to the horizon, and people in them. Thousands of people. F ranks, E ranks, farmers. Those he considered cattle. They stood in the fields with sickles and hoes and looked at him. And among them stood the grainmen, hundreds of them. Dan had been planting for 3 years, every day, every night, and every grainman knew his name, and everyone knew whose side he was on. Caedmon saw this and understood. You cannot burn a field that covers the entire horizon. You cannot kill a crop that grows faster than you can burn it. You cannot defeat a man who plants. Because death is a single act, and growth is an endless process. The battle was short. Not because Dan was stronger, because Caedmon's army refused to fight. The soldiers looked at the green fields and lowered their swords, one by one. They were hungry too, they wanted to eat too, and the man who fed them stood on the other side of the field, an F-rank farmer with a small bag of seeds. Caedmon fled. They found him a month later, in the Wastelands, alone, without an army, without an entourage. The system above his head was flickering, his SSS rank was fading, like a candle in the wind. Because the system fed on fear, and the fear was fading. The one who sows returned on his own. Dan met him in the field, at night, alone, without the grainmen. A figure out of darkness and dust, 100-year-old greenblood, the last one, driven mad by loneliness. He took ranks from the living because he wanted to return the world to its state before the schism, before the system, before the ranks. He wanted to reset everything. Dan sat down in front of him, on the ground,
like a tear before Corvin, and said, "You don't have to do this alone." Old Greenblood looked at him, 100-year-old eyes in which nothing remained but pain. Dan held out his hand. A seed lay in his palm. He said, "Plant it, together with me, for the last time." The old man took the seed. His hands were shaking. They planted it together. 4 hands, 1 hole. The earth glowed so brightly that night turned to day. No warrior grew from the seed. No grainkeeper grew. A tree grew, a huge one, with a canopy that covered the sky, with roots that went kilometers deep into the earth, that glowed with a soft green light. The system above the heads of people across the continent flickered and went out. All ranks, all letters, all inscriptions disappeared simultaneously. Old Greenblood closed his eyes, smiled. He sat down under the tree and didn't get up. Dan sat next to him until morning. Morning came. A real morning, with a real sun. For the first time in 100 years. The crack in the sky closed. Not right away, slowly, like a wound that heals. But it closed. 2 more years passed. Dan sat on the porch of the house. The house stood on a hill. Fields surrounded the hill. Green, golden, brown, different, alive. Beyond the fields lay a village. Not the first one, a new one, a big one, with stone houses, with a smithy where Hannah hammered away, with a laboratory where Minsu brewed potions, with a library where Tehi recorded everything she knew about the world without the system, with an office where Lyra corresponded with 10 cities, with a barracks where Caroline taught the young ones, not to kill, to protect. Eileen sat nearby on the porch. Her hands were in the dirt, as always. She had returned from the garden. A child slept on Dan's lap. A little one, a year old. There was nothing above his head. No letters, no numbers, no rank, no class. Just a child, just a person. The reaper stood by the fence, scythe on his shoulder, yellow eyes on the horizon. Always on the horizon, always on guard. He was digging a furrow, somewhere behind the house. Dan heard the steady sound of his palms in the earth. Vine and Root sat on the step below, holding hands, as always. Tyr sat under the tree, that very one, the huge one, with a canopy that covered half the sky. His white eyes were closed. He was breathing. The grass was growing. 5 gray militiamen stood on the road, keeping watch. Not for enemies. There were no enemies left. They just stood there. Because they didn't know how to do anything else. Because they were made to stand by his side. Dan looked at it all. At the fields, at the house, at the people, at the Zernoviks, at the child on his lap, at Eileen beside him. He didn't become a king. He didn't become a hero. He didn't become a god. He remained a farmer, F rank, level 1. The system was gone, but if it were still there, it would still see him as trash. And that was right. Because he didn't want to be anything more. He wanted a farm, a wife by his side, a child on his lap, a warm kitchen, and a field where something was growing. He got that. The reaper turned his head, looked at Dan. Yellow eyes, warm, like the sun, which was there now, real. The reaper said quietly, "Father." Dan smiled. nodded. Then he looked at the field, at the golden ears of grain swaying in the wind, at the green grass, at the white clouds in the blue sky. Real clouds, not red, white. He said, "A good day for sowing." Over 3 years, the caravan had grown into a movement that fed the cities and broke Caedmon's power. Dan had gathered 6 women around him, each of whom had found in him and his cause a healing for her own pain. The heavenly court system was destroyed when Dan and the last Greenblood planted a seed from which a tree grew, closing the crack in the sky. The end. Dan sits on the porch of his house, a child on his lap. The fields are green. The clouds are white. He remained a farmer.